Hi everyone, my name is Charlie and today I have the Anti-TBR tag. I was tagged by Emily of Novelle Novels and this tag was created by Nicole and her books. I believe that this tag is all about the books that we aren't going to purchase, we aren't going to read, the authors that we might have unpopular opinions about, and so let's just get on with things. The first question is, well, is it a question or is it a prompt? I don't know. A popular book everyone loves that you have no interest in reading. Here I actually have two books because recently these are two books on my shelves that I've had for a while that I keep considering unhauling. Firstly, we have The Mercies by Kiran, Millwood, Hargrave. This is a book that I should perhaps really enjoy. It should be a book for me. It's talking about possible witches, there's this talk of history, there's a very wintry feel to the prose. I got 30 pages in, and yet, for whatever reason, I just can't see myself going back into reading it. The idea of reading it fills me somewhat with, not dread, but it feels like a task, and perhaps there will come a point where I pick this up and I think, yeah, this is the time to read it, but currently there is the possibility that I'm considering selling it on eBay. And then another book is The Mermaid and Mrs. Hancock by Imogen Hermes Gower. I got a NetGalley edition of this and didn't get very far into it. I purchased a hard copy when it was incredibly popular. It was all over BookTube. Every big booktuber in the UK was getting a proof copy of this book and they were all very enthusiastic about it. I purchased the hardcover. I ended up giving it to a friend unread for a Christmas present because I knew they'd appreciate it more than me. I was correct. This book came into my shop. It's in a pristine condition and I paid £2 for it and still haven't read it. And it just, again, similar to The Mercies, it feels like a task for whatever reason. Even though I only ever read about 50 pages, it feels like something I'm going to have to work to get into again and feel like I have to get back to the point I was at before. And I don't know, noticeably they are both historical fiction, and historical fiction is something that I struggle with. I don't know why. A lot of the books that I read last year that I really enjoyed were historical fiction, but for whatever reason, it is always one that I really have to push myself to read, even though for the most part I still find stuff in there that's engaging and that I like. And sometimes I question it's because when I was younger I would pick up historical fiction and I'd find historical fiction that had usually been written by men and was incredibly dry, and it was almost like military history, such as like the Horatio Hornblower books or that sort of thing, the Sharps books as well, where I found the prose quite dry and couldn't get through it. But that was my first impression of historical fiction and it stuck, which isn't really good. Next we have a classic book or author you don't have an interest in reading. Unfortunately, this is Jane Austen. I have tried with Jane Austen ever since I was 10 years old. I have had multiple copies of her books in the past, trying to get through them. And she is an author I should like, she's an author I should enjoy. Every Jane Austen July comes round and I tried to participate for years, and I just think that I'm going to have to leave it to the people on BookTube who actually really adore Jane Austen and recognise, actually, I'll take a step back on this one. Jane Austen isn't for me. And I'm fine saying that. Like, she has her fans, she has dedicated people who have read and reread her books and really love what she's doing. She should be a writer for me because of her wit and because of the way she was writing and what she was writing about and the way that she's inspired generations of creative people afterwards. Indeed, some of my favourite media has been retellings of Jane Austen's works, but I just find something within the prose that's a bit impenetrable, and it's, for whatever reason, I find it a bit difficult to get through, and it's a shame. 3. An author whose books you have no interest in reading. 3.2. A problematic author whose books you have no interest in reading, and that you can combine the two. And I did decide to combine the two. Indeed, when Emily first shared this video, as I was watching her video, immediately a writer came to mind for me, and that is Lionel Shriver. And I wrote an entire paragraph about this because I needed to just get my thoughts out then and then. So it's been a week since I wrote this, so I'll just read that back to you. It's not because they're problematic, but because I don't like their prose. Lionel Shriver is the very definition of pretentious prose in my opinion, and I find something similar in their views. Oftentimes I think they make certain comments in the hopes of remaining relevant and inciting some sort of publicity. Still, I have tried to read several of their works and never have felt more disdain at such prose that just tries too hard to be literary. If their voice is supposed to be cold and mechanical, then good for them, but Lord, I do not have the time to waste on this author. 4. An author you have read a couple of books from and have decided their books are not for you. Now, I believe that me and Emily have the same author here, and that was Margaret Atwood. However, with Margaret Atwood, I could still see myself perhaps reading The Blind Assassin. I've tried to read The Handmaid's Tale many times. Oryx and Crake I found boring. I didn't like the graphic novel I read by Atwood, and there have been a few misses more than there have been hits for me. There are times when I think that she's found something she's written humorous and I haven't quite got it, and our senses of humour are on different wavelengths, and Atwood's one of those authors where with a lot of the time, if they're quite famous and they have a lot of fans, I don't feel too bad about not reading their books. And in terms of Atwood, that was the case where I was just like, actually, if I'm not enjoying it, it doesn't matter because Atwood does have tons of fans. The other author I wrote down is Anne Tyler. Anne Tyler is a writer who I've had the misfortune of having to read 2 books by, and both times I wondered what I was reading. I do not understand the hype behind Anne Tyler's works. There's another person I think could be classified as pretentious American writer, but at the same time, it's one of those things where I'm just like, just stop trying to make everything literary. Come down to earth a bit, reacquaint yourself with people, and then try writing again. 5. A genre you have no interest in, or a genre you tried to get into and couldn't. For me, there isn't a particular genre because I will read anything. I will say that romance is difficult for me to read because I have no soul, but otherwise I will try anything once and just twice to be certain. 6. A book you have bought but will never read. This can be a book you have unhauled, returned to the library unread. If I try to remember every single book that I've unhauled or returned to the library unread, we would be here for a very long time indeed. When I found out that authors got paid for their books being borrowed from libraries, but also the more books you borrowed from libraries, the more chance they had of staying open, I used to just take out 20 books at a time and then renew them as much as I could, and then I'd return a lot of them unread. But the book I've got for this is The Ghost by Robert Harris. This is a book that I've had since 2007 because it's the only book my dad has ever bought me without it being on a list. He went into Waterstones once, he doesn't read himself, he saw the title Ghost, and knowing I like fantasy, he decided to buy that. However, he didn't know that it was talking about a ghostwriter, and this is basically Robert Harris is friends with Tony Blair and decided to write this book, which is basically shining a light out of Tony Blair's arse and fictionalising it, but with different character names. And I've no time for a book like that, but because my dad bought it for me, it's probably going to be sticking around on these shelves forever, but I'm never going to read it. 7. A series you have no interest in reading, or a series you started and have DNF'd. For this, I'm going with the Shadowhunters series by Cassandra Clare, and this is because it's the big series for me. This is the series that really got me into young adult literature when I was younger. This had absolutely everything that I longed to see in fiction. It was my favourite to do with urban fantasy. It inspired me. It made me discover urban fantasy, which I had never known was a genre before, and it inspired the first book that I ever started sending off to publishers, The Soul That Rises. I adore the Shadowhunter series. I talk all the time about how I mentioned it when I started sixth form and nobody had read it, and then suddenly did it announced they were making a film and everybody was on it. It followed me through uni. I used to include it in every single one of my bibliographies about how the fact I was reading the Shadowhunters books, I really was enthusiastic about them. And then Lady Midnight came out. And I think I deleted the review of Lady Midnight from 2016, but I will never get over someone supposedly investigating the death of her parents and chooses to have sex on the beach instead. And I feel like those books changed from being more about the urban fantasy to being more about the romance and the forbidden romance, because I feel like that's what Cassandra Clare thought her readers wanted. And maybe it is what a certain type of reader wanted, but for me, the relationships are always secondary to the plot. And if it's getting in the way of the plot, it needs to be edited and you need to think about it. Like, I have no problem with the relationship being in the book, but it's just the placement of certain scenes, and maybe think more about what's necessary for the story to be told and where your characters will be at emotionally, rather than just think, I'm going to be really adult here and include a sex scene. And at that moment, I recognised I was too old for young adult literature. 8. A new release you have no interest in reading, and that is A Court of Silver Flames by Sarah J Maas. And again, I mention this because back in the day, there used to be a blog called Let the Words Flow, and the people who were part of that since went on to make The Publishing Crawl. Sarah J Maas, Kat Zhang, Susan Dennard, Savannah J Foley, and amongst others were all part of Let the Words Flow. So I followed Sarah J Maas's career from when Throne of Glass was originally titled Queen of Glass and was out for submissions. She and Susan Dennard were like picked up at the same time, and Sarah J Maas announced Throne of Glass. And this book is getting released into the world, and I'm really enthusiastic. It's a fairy tale retelling of Cinderella, where Cinderella's an assassin. And I didn't much care for it, but I still read it. I gave it a favourable review where I was lying, really, because I like the author, and I threw all of my integrity out the window because I'd liked what I'd read on Let the Words Flow. Then we had Crowd of Midnight, and I just couldn't cope with these books. As more and more books were getting released and I was hearing about them, I was ending up disappointed. Then the Beauty and the Beast retelling got mentioned, which is what this is, the sequel series to, with A Court of Thorns and Roses. And the more I read about that and the more I heard what people were saying about that and how Sarah J Maas just makes decisions based on heightening like drama rather than having any sort of like writerly integrity, I was like, okay, no point here. And then I read, what was it called last year? House of Earth and Blood, Crescent City. That book. That bloody bastarding book. My Christ, I have never read more of a rip-off of tons of other books before. It's like she took every single trope from urban fantasy and threw them at this and thought she'd change the names around a bit to have some sort of tiny little bit of Latin influence. It's like she did no research at all. She just put this book together and threw it out into the world, and without any minor editing, and like it's a bloated book at however many reads. There are decisions that are made in that might seem badass, and she was clearly going for something that was popularised in the 90s with these urban fantasy women. But I needed more than, oh my life, she's a bit different because she has red hair. I'm talking about Bryce here, because every single one of Sarah J Maas's heroines is exactly the same. They are her, basically, and I have no time for that. So she's got her fans in the world, she's going to do okay, she doesn't need me. Now, I suppose this is the point in which I am supposed to tag some people, but would you like to know something? Would you like to... I am fed up with tagging people. I don't want to do it, so I'm not going to. If you would like to be tagged, then do let me know, and you can consider yourself as such. But I can't be bothered. I hope that you have enjoyed this video. If you want to discuss anything I talked about today, then please feel free to do so in the comments, because until next time, that is all.